Hi, everyone. I can't even see who's on, but if there's anyone on, I know. Hi, thank you for coming. um, so when Naomi called, when the Eden Center reached out about being involved in this project, I was still, as Rachel said a couple of weeks ago, we were still in Israel, knee deep in quarantine and in Corona. And so the experience really got me thinking when they mentioned the topic was going to be about Taharat HaMishpacha. So the experience of Corona and being quarantined at home got me thinking about the system of ritual purity in Tanakh wholesale. And I say system because I think in Tanakh we have sort of the micro and the macro, right? We have the micro, which is the nitty gritty, the halachot, the practical rules and the applications of those halachot. But if we take a step back, what we realize is that each halachic system itself also has cultural implications, that each system cultivates a certain mindset, a certain worldview, right? And I think this holds true for all of the various halachic systems, for the dietary laws, for arayot. Just this past Shabbat, we were reading about Shemitah and Yovel, right? And it's not just about when you can work the lands and when you can't and when you can farm. But Shemitah and Yovel shapes how we see our relationship to the land, how we redefine concepts of ownership. And I think that when we talk about Taharat HaMishpacha, when we focus primarily really on our relationship with our spouses, because that time of impurity most directly affects that one relationship, the relationship with our husband. But I think that for the most part, because the laws of Taharat, of Tumah and Tahara, of ritual purity, in the absence of a Beit HaMikdash, are no longer as relevant today as they were in temple times. We've actually lost touch with a big piece of what the system at large is meant to evoke in us as individuals, as a community. And I think Corona sort of brought a lot of that up for me personally. If you look in your sources in Bamidbar Parakeh, the first sources on your sheets, it really sums up in Pasuk Bet, right there in Parakeh and Bamidbar, what I believe the ritual purity system is about. It says, Tzav et b'nei Yisrael, v'yishalchu mina machaneh kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tameh lenefesh, mizachar ad nekeva tishalechu, el michutz lamachaneh tishalchum. So it lists all the different types of people who become ritually impure through body emissions, through contact with the dead. And the reason we remove them from the camp is v'lo yitam'u et machanehem asher ani shochen b'tocham. You could stop sharing the screen. And the reason we remove them is because we can't allow them to defile the camp that God himself dwells in. And so if we look carefully, really there's an obligation on some level with that we're talking about within the system, not just to maintain ritual purity for ourselves, but on some level, the system really was about maintaining the wholesale purity of the community. Because as the Pasuk says, ritual purity is a prerequisite to approaching God. Hashem says, V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, God will dwell among us. But if we want to experience that immanence in our midst, then we need to ensure the purity of the camp. In the desert, it was the camp, and then once the Beit HaMikdash was built, then the same holds true for the Mikdash. And so ritual impurity, if you think about it, what's really interesting is that there's nothing sinful about it, right? I don't have to tell anyone on this group that having your period and being tumat nida is not sinful. But really no ritual impurity is sinful. Not tumat zav, not tumat nida. In fact, sometimes or oftentimes there are many mitzvot that actually necessitate that we become ritually impure, right? Having children, burying the dead. The ritual impurity really only comes in contact with sin when a person fails to purify, when they need to, and when they defile the camp. And it's fascinating, really, if you think about it, because a lot of ritual impurities we could keep a secret, right? Someone has an emission, don't tell anyone about it. You have Taharat, so pull your sleeve down and cover the eczema. The system demands, really, implicitly, that the onus falls on the individual to recognize that he, or I'll speak she, is part of a community, is part of a whole, and to think about how the status of his or her body directly affects the aggregate purity of the entire community. And I think there's something really, really interesting about that. Just as a side note, the punishment for someone who isn't mitaher themselves after their tameh and they do defile the camp is karet, right? They're cut off from the community. And it seems harsh, but if you think about it, it's really almost an organic extension of what that person already chose. They chose to sort of flout their responsibility that they have towards preservation of the purity of the community. And so they're cut off. It's almost it sort of ratifies the decision that they already made. So I think that the system itself cultivates a sense of responsibility of the individual towards the community, and a sense that you'll see in a second, I think we're removed from in modern times, that the decisions that a person makes for himself or herself directly affect the entirety of the community. And that system, sort of the system of ritual purity, inculcated that into the mindset of people through the way that the laws were enacted and through the ways that they were carried out. And really, ritual purity had sort of its home. It was sort of spiritually suited for the ancient world, where we were where we existed with subsistence living and extended households, and there really was no concept of the individual. But modern living, for better or for worse, because I think, right, all historical evolutions have their pros and cons, but modern living has created to a degree and perpetuated the illusion that we exist as individuals, right? That there's such a thing almost as an existential vacuum, right? So yes, we help people, and yes, we give tzedakah, and we try to do chesed, but I think on some level that raw, visceral understanding that the choices we make directly affect the people around us or directly affect the nature of the community is a concept that was so natural to Jews that were bound by the full purity system that's been lost in many ways in modern times. And then Naomi calls, and all of a sudden she calls during a time where we're told that if we cough in a store, or if our kids are asymptomatic carriers of this virus, it can spread invisibly and it could have disastrous consequences. And I think that for the first time, we've come back really to thinking of our bodies as extensions of the larger communal body. And the consciousness that was gradually worn away in recent centuries has started to seep back into our decision making and to what we think about when we decide how we are going to behave and how that's going to affect the people around us. And I think that there's something very unique in the ability of this pandemic, shockingly, sort of to give us a glimpse into that facet of Taharat and what Taharat is really all about. The flip side, and this was sort of also what I was sort of deciding which one to speak about, and then I decided to speak about both. The flip side, it's almost sort of the ironic, maybe binary almost to the thought I just mentioned, is that I think on some level, as conceptually aware we've become of sort of that which exists outside of us, physically we've become very isolated. And that isolation for many of us has created a scenario where the noise and the static and the things that normally monopolize our attention and our consciousness really are suddenly quiet or even irrelevant. And I think we're forced really, or many of us were forced during this period to face ourselves. And it's very interesting because water is the element that's used in Tanakh to purify. And it's not surprising. Water is the primordial substance. You have it on your sheets at the third. I skipped the source. Okay. You have it on your sheets, the third source, when it talks about the creation of the world, right? We sometimes imagine that before there was creation, it was a vacuum, right? We sort of say, there was creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. But if we look at the sources, it says, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, God creates the world. What existed before? V'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu. Right? There was just this sort of unformed potential, the choshech al pnei tehom, and then what existed already? The ruach elokim mirachefet al pnei hamayim. The ruach, the sort of spirit of God, was hovering over the waters. And so, water in Tanakh is the ultimate. It's the primordial substance. It's the element that existed prior to everything. It was what was there before the universe took shape. And so it symbolizes really the whole of potentiality. If water was there before creation, then all potential inheres in water. The famous psychoanalyst, and Rachel, you can weigh in on this after, your thoughts on this. Carl Jung talks about the idea of being engulfed by waters as symbolizing the return to the womb, or the desire to return to the womb, which really means facing ourselves, our innermost selves. The selves that we were when we were still raw potential, before creation of us, right? Before life essentially got in the way, before we were impacted and formed by all of those things around us. And so Carl Jung talks about how water, for that reason, can be terrifying, right? To sort of face ourselves. But it's also, for the same reason, why immersion in water is what enables rebirth. Because in order to be reborn, we need to face, right, that sort of raw, unformed potential. And we see this throughout Tanakh. We see water functioning in this manner all over the place. And we have it, the most obvious example really, right, is the case of the flood. where the world has to start anew. And so waters engulf the world, and then the world is reborn. There's a new creation, but it has to be engulfed with those waters. It has to resort to that primordial chaos before that rebirth can happen. When Bnei Israel are leaving Mitzrayim, and we're about to be born, essentially as a nation, into a new national being altogether, we don't just leave Mitzrayim, we walk b'toch hayam b'yabasha, right? We have to walk into the water. We face our enemies, we face ourselves, and that experience, not just of Kriyat Yam Suf, but of getting into the water, is what enabled them to emerge as a new people. I think maybe the best example, am I running out of time? I have a minute. I think the best example really of this really psychological process is the story of Yonah, right? Yonah was running away from his calling. Yonah resisted who he was, and he had to have that experience of being completely engulfed, of being swallowed up by the sea, or in his case specifically the sea monster, right, as symbolized by the whale, to reconnect with those pieces of himself that he had lost sight of. So I think that quarantine has forced all of us into a place where, to greater and lesser degrees, we've had to face ourselves. The volume, right? It doesn't mean that we're not concentrating and focusing on everything else that's going on around us. Of course we are. It's impossible nowadays to disconnect. But the volume, that the background noise that's normally turned up so high has been lowered, and the frenetic pace that normally keeps us distracted has slowed. So like Yonah, in normal life, we run to Tarshish, right? We escape into that frenetic pace. Corona, the waters, or for some people, the storm really has caught up with us, and we've gone into our tevas, and we've had to face ourselves, and we've had time to think about who we are, and what we want to look like when we emerge. And I think that's ultimately really what immersion in the mikveh is meant to evoke. In the water, we're stripped down, right? We let go of our defenses, and for that moment, we just float in the silence as we truly are. And I think that water allows for that process if we allow it to, right? If we sort of experience the water in the way that we can, it can really be transformative in a lot of ways. Humans are, I'll wrap up with this thought. I think that humans are all about muscle memory, right? When we're teaching kids to walk, so we hold their hands up and they learn how to use their muscles. And then when we let go, we hope that the muscle memory or the experience of that feeling is what enables them to do it on their own. Same thing, we hold a bike, right, from the back. Everyone in quarantine is learning how to ride bikes. So we hold the bike from the back and the child learns what it feels like to balance on those two wheels. And essentially what we do when we're teaching muscles how to function is we're simulating the experience with them so that they know how to do it and recreate that experience on their own. I think our brains are muscles too, big muscles. And I think Corona, in a lot of ways, and the experience of this entire bizarre reality that we find ourselves in, has simulated aspects of the Tumah and Taharat process, and particularly of Taharat HaMishpacha, that we might not have been able to tap into before. And so I think that if we can hold on to, on the one hand, our awareness of our place within the whole and how profoundly our choices impact those around us, even if, or specifically if, we don't realize how those choices are going to ripple. And at the same time, also embrace the ability we have to confront ourselves, to touch base with who we really are. And then hopefully when the masks come off, literally and figuratively, right? Then we'll be able to connect to these added dimensions of Taharat HaMishpacha. And if we could, again, sort of have that muscle memory and draw from the experiences of this crazy period, then I hope in a lot of ways Taharat HaMishpacha can become that much more meaningful for people as they embark on their own journeys. So thanks for listening.